Thanks for watching Endgame Economics. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. It's completely free for you, and it helps us continue making more videos like this.
Welcome to This Explainer. You ever met someone who takes the worst insult you could possibly throw at them and just turns it into their entire personality? Well, what happens when an entire metropolis does exactly that? Today, we're diving into the profound psychological double vision of a city that took the worst insults ever thrown its way and literally weaponized them into a global brand. We are going inside the mind of Chicago, exploring the psychology of a place that is famously defiant, tribal, allergic to pretension, and carries a chip on its shoulder roughly the size of the Sears Tower.
So is it really as bad as they say? It's a simple question, but man, it sparks a massive cognitive dissonance for both locals and outsiders. Think about it. The winters are notoriously brutal, and statistically speaking, it's known as the most corrupt big city in America. Yet, for millions of fiercely loyal residents, it is absolutely the only place they would ever want to live. That wild contradiction reveals a defiant, transactional, and fiercely tribal operating system that we are going to break down right now. Take this quote from 1952 by New Yorker writer A.J. Liebling. He didn't just critique the city, he diagnosed it with a very deep wound. He actually dubbed it Chicago, the Second City. And let's be clear, that was a title meant to land like a slap in the face. But Chicago uniquely metabolized this insult into armor. In a move that perfectly captures the whole vibe of the city, a group of young comedians took that exact insult and named their theater after it. They turned a humiliating put-down into the Second City, which went on to become a massive global comedy empire. To really understand how this place ticks, we're going to look at 6 distinct traits. 1. The Second City Complex. 2. A city of neighborhoods. 3. The currency of clout. 4. The defiant posture. 5. The religion of losing. And finally, 6. Make no little plans.
All right, let's jump straight into trait number 1, the Second City Complex and the architecture of a chip on the shoulder.
Now, some folks will generously tell you that the Second City moniker was just a harmless census statistic, right? Because Chicago literally was the second largest U.S. city from 1890 all the way to 1982. But honestly, the reality goes so much deeper. It was a deeply ingrained belief system born out of pure heartbreak. Just imagine hosting the spectacular 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, looking like the absolute, undisputed future of America, and then just totally fumbling the ball. Massive industries like the automobile bypassed them entirely. They were left playing catch-up, which resulted in what Liebling saw as a psychological posture of constant East Coast envy.
Moving righty along to trait number 2, a city of neighborhoods, or a mental map drawn in hard lines.
So, zooming in from the macro to the micro, we find the city's central dichotomy. Historically, Chicagoans navigated their world using a highly specific internal GPS based entirely on parishes and blocks. They'd actually introduced themselves by their Catholic parish. This created cohesive, vital ethnic neighborhoods. That's the warmth, the block parties, the corner tavern, the fierce local loyalty. But here is the dark twin of that reality. That exact same parochial instinct that creates charming, tight-knit communities also violently curds into the architecture of systemic segregation. The drive to insulate the community from outsiders became this tragic, deeply entrenched mechanism of exclusion.
Just wrap your head around that number for a second. 85%. As hundreds of thousands of Black Americans arrived during the Great Migration, the city's machinery of containment just locked firmly into place. By the 1920s, widespread racially restrictive covenants and brutal federal redlining, which, by the way, Chicago helped pioneer, kept a staggering 85% of the city entirely off-limits to African Americans. Sure, the law changed decades ago, but the mental and physical map it drew, you can still see those hard lines today.
This brings us to trait number 3, the currency of clout, where politics operates as a favor economy.
In almost any other city, the word clout just means influence. But here, it is a precise technical term. When waves of immigrants arrived with absolutely zero safety net, it was the famous political machine that caught them. If you needed coal in the winter, or maybe a job, you didn't go to a government agency, you went straight to the local precinct captain. Every single favor was a debt, and every debt was a vote. In this environment, knowing how the favor economy works isn't viewed as corruption at all. It's simply viewed as essential literacy for survival.
And believe me, that literacy is heavily practiced. 1,792. That is the unbelievable number of federal public corruption convictions in the Northern District of Illinois between 1976 and 2020. I mean, they had 2 consecutive governors go to prison in the 2000s.
When you hear stats like that, you really start to understand why residents treat politics with this gritty transactional realism. Chicagoans don't expect fairness. They expect the deal, and they pretty much just assume the fix is already in.
All right, trait number 4, the defiant posture. This is defiance serving as a civic operating system.
We have to talk about this incredible poem by Carl Sandburg from 1914 because it perfectly captures the city's load-bearing coping mechanism. It's essentially the classic improv comedy role of yes and. Sandburg doesn't deny the critics who call the city wicked or crooked. Instead, Chicago concedes every single awful criticism directed at it and then instantly dares you to find a city with more raw vigor and strength. You concede the wound and then you weaponize it. That is the civic operating system at work.
Now, apply that defiance to today. The objective data tells a really surprising story. By 2025, homicides actually fell to 417. That is a 60-year low, representing a nearly 50% drop from the tragic peak of 805 just 4 years prior. And yet, if you look at national political narratives or spend 5 minutes on social media, you'd think the city was an out-of-control war zone. The city's safety is constantly used as a rhetorical prop, completely regardless of what the actual numbers are showing on the ground.
This quote from a police veteran hits the nail right on the head. It perfectly captures the agonizing cognitive dissonance of being trapped inside a stale national narrative. See, while the citywide averages improve, violence remains heavily concentrated in very specific neighborhoods. That means both the safe statistics and the grieving families are telling the truth. And this forces locals to constantly perform an exhausting defense of their home. Just imagine having to constantly justify the safety of your own neighborhood to outsiders who aren't even checking the math.
Let's shift gears to trait number 5, the religion of losing, a mindset built entirely on heartbreak.
This brings us into the realm of sports, which is honestly the absolute cleanest map of Chicago's tribal psychology. Choosing a baseball team here, it isn't really about wanting to win. It's an intense declaration of class identity and a lifelong commitment to a very specific tradition of suffering. On the north side, you've got the Cubs, who famously went 108 years without a World Series win, fully embracing that nationally marketed lovable losers brand. And then on the south side, you have the White Sox, embodying this resentful, working-class chip-on-the-shoulder defiance. The rivalry maps perfectly onto the city's deep parochial boundaries. You don't stay a fan because it's easy. You stay because it's yours.
And finally, trait number 6, make no little plans and the megalomaniac streak.
Because underneath all that blue-collar modesty and lovable losing lies a shocking contradiction, an imperial, megalomaniacal ambition to periodically rebuild the very concept of the modern city. Think about this timeline. A normal place gets destroyed by a massive fire, and they just try to rebuild, right? Not Chicago. Their response was to metabolize sheer catastrophe into pure hubris. Within 14 years of the Great Fire, they birthed the first steel-framed skyscraper out of the rubble. And within 2 decades, they hosted 28 million people at a World's Fair that completely redefined the modern metropolis.
Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. That massive chip on the shoulder we've been talking about? It's the exact same engine that drove architect Daniel Burnham's sweeping ambition. Because the city always feels underestimated, it periodically feels this intense need to do something undeniably massive. Burnham's plan secured 25 miles of pristine public lakefront for the people. It was an absolute civilization-scale flex disguised as a public park. It proves that Chicago's modesty and its megalomania aren't opposites at all. They actually feed each other.
So, pulling it all together, these traits, defiant, parochial, transactional, megalomaniacal, they are not just isolated quirks. Together they form a unified, incredibly resilient operating system for a place that outright refuses to be pitied. It's a city that literally turns contempt into identity. The very instincts that make it wonderfully warm and loyal are the exact same instincts that make it deeply divided and segregated.
So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. Can a city actually outgrow its historical coping mechanisms and solve its deep structural divides without losing the very soul that makes it so fascinating in the first place? As the reality on the ground evolves, while the rest of the country looks away, Chicago is forced to decide if it's finally time to put the armor down or if the fight itself is still the beating heart of the city. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the narratives behind the places we live.